Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be getting started here in a moment. We're going to wait another moment or so to let folks join.
Okay, we're right at 11:32 this morning, and so we'll go ahead and get things kicked off. I appreciate everyone being here. My name is T.O. Bowman. I'm a program planner that leads the city's sustainability office and the planning department. Joining me from the sustainability office is Sarah Terry Kobo, the other half of the sustainability office, and then also our friends and partners at Rocky Mountain Institute, Jubing and Matthew, that I'll let them introduce themselves here shortly. So I wanted to provide a brief amount of context about this call and about Brownfields in general. So in Oklahoma City, late last year, we were contacted by Rocky Mountain Institute and Matthew, and we've had some conversations stemming from the Brownfields conference that was hosted here in Oklahoma City very recently about the idea of Brightfields, generating clean energy on Superfund sites, brownfields, landfills, and knowing the history of Oklahoma City and Oklahoma in general, we know that there are a lot of those sites around, and so we have a very robust brownfields programs both at the state level and at the city level, and so we're interested to see at the city opportunities that exist. Some of these may involve the city, some may not involve the city, but ways that we can use underutilized properties to be more productive partners in the community is of interest, I think, and of a benefit to the city. So with that, I'm gonna hand the show over to Matthew and let him take the show from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Tio. Hey, everyone. Matthew Popkin joining you live from one of the crown jewels of brownfield revitalization in Oklahoma City, the Bricktown area. Happy to be with you all today. Thanks for joining. This is going to be a slightly, not exactly a webinar, more of like an interactive presentation, conversation, discussion. So if you are here just to listen and learn, that's fine. If you have questions, please feel free to either come off mute, put them in the chat, or just ask when we have those kind of question breaks. I'm very comfortable welcoming questions throughout the conversation, especially if there's something that you're not familiar with or would help you understand the rest of the conversation in context as we go. So please don't hesitate to ask. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We have probably about half the time here set aside for kind of a presentation, and then a whole open session for Q&A and discussion. And we'll gladly take any questions or comments you have. So I'm going to double check. Are you able to all see my screen? Is that coming through loud and clear there? Excellent. So welcome and thank you, T.O., Sarah, Oklahoma City, for welcoming this educational presentation. We do a lot of these across the country, actually, in a whole range of different cities, counties, and communities. So this specifically, we're going to talk about reusing brownfields to reinvest in Oklahoma communities with Brightfields. If this is the first time you're hearing some of these terms, that's okay. We'll talk through that too. Before we jump in here, though, I do want to just double check people's familiarity with Zoom. I know folks have been using a whole range of web applications and online meeting applications now for quite a few years, but just want to remind folks of a few things here. First of all, when we do get to the discussion later, I'd encourage people to keep their screen on gallery view, whether your camera's on or off, so that you can see the full range of people who are asking questions and responding to questions. So that's pretty straightforward there. You just go up to the view and then gallery view selection. Also want to highlight, if your name showed up as a number or as something that you are not liking to be called by, please rename yourself there so I can make sure to refer to you appropriately as we go through the discussion. Ideally, putting your name and organization or entity would be awesome, so we know who's here. But we'll have some other ways of tracking that too, just for our own benefit. As I mentioned before, if you have questions, comments, if you can't hear something, if there's a technology issue, please use that chat feature that's in your toolbar there, and you can send that message to us and we can respond. So let's launch a quick poll. Jubin, can we throw that up? Just to get people familiar with some Zoom functionality here. How well do you know Zoom? Tell us right now, and this will help us make sure that we are appropriately using the features and not leaving anyone behind. So you should see this very, very challenging poll in front of you. And good luck passing this. We're going to do a variety of Zoom features today to just keep folks make this a little bit more interactive and not just a boring webinar here. So hopefully some of these features will help stimulate the conversation and support our overall educational efforts. Good. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. Thank you. There's some good company here. A lot of people are familiar with mute, which is good because that will be one of the most valuable features today for when we don't want to hear from people and when we do. The chat feature, great. As I mentioned before, if you're not as familiar, just make sure you find that in case you want to respond or ask a question there and don't want to come off mute. And I see some folks who are not familiar with the annotation feature. Don't fear, we have a tutorial set up for you on that. It's a really handy tool for some of the things, and we're going to use that in a bit. So thanks for joining us on that. So great, moving forward. My name is Matthew Popkin, as Tio said. I'm joined by my colleague Jubing. We are half the team here at the Rocky Mountain Institute's Brownfields Accelerator initiative. And so that's helping communities across the country accelerate and deploy and fund Brownfields projects. We'll define exactly what we mean by that in a moment. But that's our main focus. We work with US cities and communities generally across the board on various energy transition strategies to help them meet their sustainability goals and to help advance a clean, sustainable, and healthy local economy. We are partnered with Kansas State University's Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. The Brownfields Accelerator is a direct collaboration with Blaze and Scott, just north of the border there in Oklahoma at Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas there. They could not join us today based on schedules, but just know that they are hand in hand with us on this journey and the support that they are providing to communities. If you're not familiar with Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI, we are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to accelerating a clean, prosperous, clean energy future for all. We try to lead by example in that too. And so here are two of our offices in Colorado, though we do have 5 offices across the US. We were founded in 1982, and we now work across the US in 60 different countries. And we really focus on research, systems thinking, and unconventional partnerships to support strategies that make sense to advance a market-based sustainable energy system for all. Kansas State University is part of a broader US EPA-funded technical assistance to Brownfields network to help communities address Brownfields challenges more broadly. So we are a clean energy reuse partner to communities and to KSU Tab here and to multiple tabs actually. But KSU Tab actually provides a whole range of other services, including community visioning, assessing and cleaning up and redeveloping brownfields properties for a whole range of purposes, not just clean energy, to understand health and technology and compliance issues, as well as funding and financing strategies for a whole range of different reuse options and cleanup options. So that's the broader network. If you've never heard of the TAB network, it's a really, really valuable service offered free to communities across the country that is EPA supported. I actually first encountered the TAB program myself when I was working with communities, not even on a clean energy project, and started working with them on funding for brownfields projects generally. We are specifically focused on working with Kansas State University, as I mentioned before, on Brownfields or clean energy projects on brownfields to help educate communities and site owners about brownfield reuse options that include clean energy. Case in point, today's exact event, to provide pre-development site evaluation and analysis to communities who are considering brownfields, and to provide other technical assistance and tools to help with reuse planning, funding, financing, and clean energy procurement, and a whole range of things in between all of this. So if this is of interest to you after the conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll provide our emails at the end, and we'll share the slide deck as well. Before we jump in, just like to align with folks on a few key ground rules just to make this virtual event go smoothly. First, we really appreciate you joining, and we hope that this is going to be a valuable use of the next 50 minutes of your time. And we ask ideally that you be present. Close other apps, email, messaging, notifications, things, except Zoom, as if we were in person doing this together, or as if you were walked into a conference session where we were kind of hosting this together. Be aware, so keep yourself muted. It seemed like everyone's familiar with the mute button from that early poll. During the presentation when others are speaking, and if you tend to be the one to ask a lot of questions, as I do, please also be a little bit of a gut check on yourself to create space for others to contribute or ask questions when we get to the discussion. And last but certainly not least, please embrace this as a learning environment, kind of a no stupid questions approach. This is truly an introduction to the topic for many of us. And if you are joining us from the private sector to learn as well, that's fantastic. Please keep in mind this is not a sales environment, and that anyone who violates that will be removed from this event. And I have kicked people out before. So no sales pitches today. Thanks. Today's agenda, we're going to walk through in a brief presentation what are Brownfields, establish some baseline knowledge. We're going to talk about why we should even be talking about this, understand the potential opportunity, and then how. Outline, if this is of interest and aligns with some of your goals and needs, how can communities start to move forward, or how can site owners start to move forward with this? That should be, in the next half an hour, what we cover, the what, why, and how. And then happy to go down any rabbit holes you want with any questions, and we'll see where we go for the rest of the journey. So before we dive into the content, I just want to get a sense of who's actually joining us today. We appreciated your answers and questions in the registration, but I think for everyone's benefit here, I'd love to know kind of who you are and where you're based. So to do that, we're going to use this annotation feature in Zoom. If you've never used it or haven't used it very often, what I'm going to ask is that you should see at the top of your screen this View Options dropdown. You're going to click Annotate. That's going to reveal this toolbar, or it might be on the side of your screen, depending on what version of Zoom you have. And then we're specifically going to use the stamp feature of Zoom. There are a lot of really cool features here. We're going to focus on not creating modern art and really just using some stamp features to advance the next couple activities. So if you can't figure out where to find this, please ask in the chat function. Otherwise, we're going to dive right in. Again, you go to View Options, Annotate, and select Stamp. So simply put, how would you describe yourself and who you work for? Just genuinely want to know kind of the background of and professions of folks joining us. There's no wrong answer. A lot of these brownfield projects and brightfield projects take a whole range of folks to make happen. Great, I'll give this about 10 more seconds, Jubing, then I'll ask you to save and clear that. Great. Appreciate if you can try to just put one answer for yourself, even though you might feel very passionate about the organization that you represent. All right, Jubing, let's go save this and clear the responses so we can have a fresh slide for the next one. Excellent. Thanks all. We're going to do the same thing here. Where are you based? Except with one caveat here. I'm going to ask one that you indicate, whether you're in Oklahoma or not. And in case you are not familiar with where Oklahoma is, I've had a handy dandy tutorial here. And most importantly, I want to know, ideally, if you are consider yourself in an urban area, use the heart, as in the heart of a city. If you are more in a suburb or kind of small community there, use a check mark. And if you can see the stars at night because you have just a crystal clear view of the sky in a rural community, please let us know as well. Wow, I'm feeling like very much an outsider here, being just north of your westernmost panhandle in Colorado. Great. Good. Looks like we have a nice mix of folks joining us within Oklahoma, and appreciate you all taking the time. Jimmy, let's save this and we'll move on. Great. We're going to continue using the annotation feature here. Just rank your level of knowledge of these three topics currently. If you consider yourself to have, no to low experience with brownfields, just indicate that with a stamp. If you consider yourself to be an expert in clean energy or bright fields, please go ahead and indicate that as well. Again, there's no wrong answer here. This is a 101 type education session for a reason, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll all have shifted to the right on this scale. Excellent. I'll give that 5 more seconds, then Jubing will put it over to you to save that and clear it. Excellent. And then last, but certainly not least, I'm curious to know why you guys are all joining us today. And I think we can see kind of what that distribution is. So if you know nothing about this topic and are just joining to learn more, go ahead and throw that stamp in that right box there. If your community is starting to explore this type of, if you or your community is starting to explore this type of project and want to understand whether this is a good idea, go ahead and throw that stamp in that box next to it. If you work closely with someone involved in redeveloping a brownfield and want to know what's possible, go ahead and indicate there. If you're looking to pursue an innovative sustainability project and want to know if you're just a book or truly novel, there's a little pun for literature folks here. Please go ahead and indicate that. If you consider yourself an expert in the topic and intend to heavily critique this presentation, welcome. We're looking forward to the conversation. Please go ahead and indicate that in the box. And if you're just trying to figure out the best way to get to lunchtime today, we appreciate your honesty. Great. Final call for stamps here. Sounds like a lot of folks, in fact, a majority of folks here are actually trying to explore this and figure out whether this makes sense. So fantastic. Hopefully you will walk away with an enhanced sense of understanding of this by the end, at least in some areas. And again, happy to follow up afterwards if you have more questions beyond what the discussion allows today. Good. We're going to move on then. You can go ahead and close that annotation toolbar just so you can click around without annoying anyone. There's a little red X on that toolbar that you should be able to just exit out, and then you won't be putting more stamps as we go through this for now. So as I mentioned today, our agenda is going to focus on what, why, and how of Brightfields. And we're going to start with that what right now. So if this is new to you, simply put, Brightfields repurpose brownfields with renewable energy to support a more local and equitable energy transition. A brownfield, for those who are not as familiar, is defined by the US EPA as a property where the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of that site may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Common brownfields include former industrial sites, factories, inactive landfills, dumps, mines, closed power plants, abandoned dry cleaners, abandoned shopping malls, the list goes on. They don't always all just look brown like the two examples here, but imagery is helpful. A Brightfield, as I mentioned, is just clean energy on a former brownfield or Superfund site or landfill or RCRA site. We'll talk about those distinctions later if that's of interest. They can be on the land directly. They can also be on the property itself or a structure. So that top picture there is actually an old steel mill in Pittsburgh where they put 2 megawatts of solar on that roof entirely to cover that and actually built an innovation center underneath it for advanced robotics. So there are a whole different range of ways that like a Brightfield can technically be built. And we'll talk about some of those design factors in a minute. Brightfields, simply put, come in all shapes and sizes. They can be small projects that often look like a greenfield project in a field, but technically it's a complicated landfill or some other type of site. It can be kind of worming its way around different infrastructure, as you see in that top right and in a Maryland landfill there. Or it could be a wind farm, actually. Despite the name, Brightfields can be multiple different technologies. We'll show that breakdown as well. They can come in all shapes and sizes. Specifically, when we're talking about landfill solar projects and other bright fields, one of the benefits of this is that it's they have flexible design opportunities. And so you can adapt to site-specific needs and purposeful design, as long as that's communicated to the developers, as long as that's communicated to those who are contracting this up front, so people know what they're getting into. Specifically here, these are 3 examples of landfill solar projects. This shows 2 different ways to ballast the system so that the steel does not actually puncture the cap or the ground on the landfill, and it just rests there and actually weighs down there. So if you're concerned about hurricane force winds, or in your case, F1, 2, 3 strength tornadoes, these also provide some weighting to hold down the solar so that they don't get blown around as well during extreme weather events. You can also ballast mount or loft kind of the conduit and the wiring and the other electrical equipment so that truly nothing is below the surface. Some sites allow for some surface penetration, to a certain depth without complicating it further. Some don't want to touch that at all. So both of those are valid ways to pursue the design here, and there are options. And lastly, there are different infrastructure elements that folks have to work around, especially on a closed landfill, such as these methane monitoring wells or venting or other access roads to allow for ongoing operations and maintenance. And the designs can work around that too. Again, the objective here is clarity of what the needs are for that site, and design can follow. I mentioned that Brightfields typically, hence the name, use solar power, but they can use other renewable energy technologies. The most common secondary one here is wind energy. And then you have a little bit of biomass and geothermal. We're going to mostly talk about solar today because it's the most common and perhaps the most flexible design-wise. But just know that there are options depending on what you're looking for. When we're talking about this, it's important to understand kind of what benefits can come to communities. We'll also talk about some of the inherent challenges of this in a bit. But communities can leverage Brightfields to deliver a whole range of local benefits, from sustainable reusing land to using existing infrastructure to supporting local jobs and site revitalization, especially from a site that really wasn't activated previously or has not been active in decades. Advancing environmental justice, depending on where the site is or has been cited. There were often historical exclusions from who could participate in that process of deciding whether that was even cited in their neighborhood. And so, this is one way to start to address some of those decades-long challenges. Another benefit here is to, depending on the structure, generate local revenue from site reuse, depending on whether there are, property taxes involved. There's other sales tax from the construction. There's a lot of ways to generate local revenue, land leases as well. The important thing is you're reactivating a site, and with that comes, reactivating economic power. And then depending on how it's connected, there's an opportunity for, fixed cost, no fuel type projects to hedge against rising utility bills. This is not distinct to Brightfields, but it is another potential benefit. So that's the what. I think we covered the baseline pretty quickly there. I'm going to go into what I think is most exciting here, which is the potential opportunity, and happy to answer any design questions as we go. So we're going to focus now on the why and understand the potential opportunity that exists. So Brightfields offer a large, yet largely untapped potential market, especially with new federal incentives that were created. We'll talk about some of those in a minute. The EPA has estimated over 190,000 potential brownfield sites across the country could be potentially suitable for clean energy deployment. I specifically led a research effort a couple of years ago to look at closed and inactive landfills specifically, where you can't really build the next hotel, you can't build the next conference center, you can't build the next brick town. And that could host up to 63 gigawatts of solar across just 4,300 closed and inactive landfills, and there are far more than that in the country. Yet there are only 530 completed Brightfields projects across the US, totaling just 2.5 gigawatts through October of last year. So really, when we think about the potential, just 1% of those sites could support up to 6 gigawatts of clean energy and over 60,000 jobs in construction and ongoing maintenance. You can see the distribution in that map as well here of kind of where the projects have been sited. We'll talk about a little bit of that distinction in a moment. The important thing to note here is that the solar market is increasingly comfortable with landfill solar projects in particular, with just under a gigawatt of installed capacity to date, over 300 plus landfill solar projects. So while there haven't been any actually in Oklahoma, there have been many developers and communities that have tested out this approach in other states and other communities to understand what works well, what's the right way to site this, how do we want to phase this in, how do we want to plan and procure these projects. So there's examples that have already been done, and not just a few, over 300, but hopefully someone here might be the first one to deploy one in Oklahoma. When we look about the states that have been really leading in this, you see really it's concentrated in New England, right? Going back to our slide here, you see that cluster in New England. Most of that's in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey and New York. And so now when we jump back to this chart, right, you see that distribution here very clearly. Over a quarter of the sites of Brightfields have been in Massachusetts alone. And that's not because they're known for particularly good solar. It's actually based on the policies and the procedures and the planning that has gone into saying, hey, this is how we want to use our land. This is what we're comfortable saying yes to. And this is where we would like clean energy to be prioritized. And you've seen other states, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, follow very much there. And so while a few of these states did lead the push, we are actually seeing these projects becoming part of the clean energy transition across America and at scale. So I mentioned that Pittsburgh project, 2 megawatts of solar on that old steel mill in southeast Pittsburgh. Really cool example there. Weirton, West Virginia, the first Brightfield project I actually worked on, is now planned for about 30 megawatts on an island in the middle of the Ohio River between Ohio and West Virginia. Martin County, Kentucky, on an old coal mine, they are planning to deploy 200 megawatts of solar. Franklin County, Ohio is planning 50 megawatts of solar on a closed landfill, one of the largest in the country, only to be outdone by Houston, Texas, that is aiming for 52 megawatts of solar and community solar on a 240-acre closed urban landfill. That's a rendering. It's not yet built. It's permitted with TCEQ just below you to the south, but it is not yet constructed yet. I also want to highlight another example of how Brightfields can co-locate with economic activity. The Method Clean Supply Factory in the south side of Chicago actually highlights how co-locating Brightfields with new manufacturing can help promote sustainable land reuse and support new community investment. And so you have this factory. It's a beautiful facility if you've never been there or never seen it before. They co-located some wind and solar on site, which is all on a brownfield with their facility to achieve a LEED Platinum designation in an urban environment and help Method really advance its corporate goals. So there are ways this is not an all or nothing proposition when we're talking about renewable energy siting on brownfields. It doesn't have to necessarily displace or shouldn't displace other planned economic activity, trying to figure out where we can site things that aren't happening or co-locate with things that already are. I mentioned those federal incentives earlier. So the recently created and enhanced federal incentives, mostly tax credits, increase the financial feasibility for clean energy reuse. It enhanced existing tax credits for renewable energy development, and those are site agnostic tax credits. It extends new financial incentives and mechanisms to support Brightfield developments in particular, and created multiple federal grants as well to invest in renewable energy projects on brownfields and in energy communities. The federal tax credit enhancements or adders now also incentivize projects like Brightfields to make local dollars go even further. And so the priority here is to think about, with what are we building this? What kind of materials are they domestic based? Where are they sited? And this is where this really kicks in. The definition of energy communities includes brownfields, coal communities, and other communities where employment has heavily relied on fossil fuel sectors. And who benefits. So for projects under 5 megawatts that financially benefit tribal communities or low-income communities, there's an additional incentive there. And so when you look at that stack, you start with traditionally a 30% investment tax credit, or an equivalency for the production tax credit. I'm just using one of these as an example. And you can start to see how these adders add up to a percentage of the capital cost credits overall. You could get up to 70%. More likely, you're probably looking at yourself between 40 and 60% here. Again, it depends on design, it depends where they're located, and it depends on who's benefiting from this. I mentioned that Oklahoma does not have a landfill solar project. Oklahoma is not particularly leading the way in solar, though there certainly is that opportunity. And this is what I wanted to highlight. The levels here present a prime opportunity in terms of the actual sun that you actually get to capture that as an energy source. And you see Texas really crushing it there. So if you want to try to catch up or compete with your neighbors there up in Colorado or down in Texas, this could be a great way to start. Likewise, well, not likewise, actually, on the contrary, Oklahoma is one of the leaders in wind potential, which really presents a prime opportunity here if you wanted to site wind on some of these sites. You're not going to put a wind turbine through a closed landfill, but maybe it's on the buffer area around something like that. This is an area where Oklahoma really is a success story. Texas still the leader there. Everything's a little bit bigger in Texas, but Oklahoma is a close second here in the country, I believe, in terms of installed wind capacity. So that's a very quick jump through of some of the why and the opportunity here. Again, happy to unpack that more in discussion. Simply put, I'm hoping that what you take away from this is that by understanding what's possible, communities and site owners and utilities can include Brightfields as part of a broader strategy for the energy transition and for community revitalization. And so when we think about this again, there are hundreds of thousands of brownfields available across the country. The technical potential of Brightfields is significant, and there are new and enhanced federal incentives to advance Brightfields. And what I didn't add on this slide is actually Oklahoma has great solar and wind resources already. And so how do you capture that and use that to your advantage? So I want to do a quick pulse check before we dive into just a little bit more content before our kind of break discussion for Q&A. How are you feeling after learning the basics of Brightfields? I'm going to suggest we just use the chat function for this, though if you're really passionate about the annotation feature, feel free. Number one, are you excited by this? Are you intrigued but need to learn more? Are you unsure? Are you skeptical? Are you not interested, or do you not think it's a fit for your community? Or you're getting even more excited for lunch? There's no wrong answer here again. Just want to know kind of where people are feeling. You can just type the number into the chat if you want, or you can annotate directly on the screen. Two and six. I think it's very fair to be intrigued about this and be excited for lunch. Jim's writing, I'm encouraged by the opportunity to make lemonade from site lemons. Excellent. I'm guessing there's that still one person there who is intending to heavily scrutinize this presentation. Good. So while you're finishing that, yes, quick question from Spencer on presentation access. Yes, we will share the entire slide deck after this for your awareness and review. This is intended to be educational, and we hope you will take it and run with it. Yeah, I will pause here then for a couple questions before we dive into kind of the final piece of this. So let me stop sharing my screen for a moment. And I see Montel, you had a question here. You want to just come off mute or you want to type it in the chat? There's no wrong way to do this.
I'll just ask you, hear me
Great.
okay? Yeah. In the number of different examples you showed of bright fields around the country, do you know roughly what percentage of them were connected at either the distribution level or the transmission level?
Yes. So I believe that a majority of the ones are planned for connection at the transmission level. If you're familiar with transmission and distribution planning, you know it takes some years. The Pittsburgh example on the steel mill, that was distribution level or on-site specifically. The others, I believe, are intended to be connected at the transmission level. Maybe the one in West Virginia, the 30 megawatt one, is at the distribution level, given its size. But I believe most are trying to get at that broader interconnection for transmission.
So I assume none of them were behind the meter.
The Pittsburgh one, I believe, is potentially behind the meter. And there are definitely a lot of examples of bright fields that are behind the meter. So it certainly could be. And you could certainly envision a situation where you have on-site operations or adjacent operations to a wastewater treatment plant or a power plant or a closed landfill where that's directly feeding into some of the operational uses. That's certainly an option and certainly does exist across the country. The opportunities that I highlighted more at that scale, kind of that more small to medium utility scale level, are less likely to be a behind the meter play.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And just for those who are less familiar with kind of front of meter, behind the meter distinctions, Montel was really trying to understand, how much of this is going through the grid to actually power operations or support the utility needs, and how much of this is going through kind of the direct building, like as if you were installing solar on your house, which would just power your house specifically. There are other ways to connect, smaller scale projects, I should say, directly to the on-site facility operations if there's enough consumption or need for that electricity. Great question, Montel. One of the advantages of this, and we talked briefly about proximity, but Montel, building on your question there, one of the advantages of bright fields is that brownfield sites, closed landfills, heavy industrial facilities, a lot of those are formerly or presently located next to a lot of existing grid infrastructure because they were high power users to begin with, or located next to a lot of existing physical infrastructure to make their operations previously or currently happen. So you often will have some of that. In some cases, for a closed power plant situation, you might even have existing interconnection rights that exist that if something has been closed or retired or a portion of that plant has been converted or closed, that you might be able to leverage in this that could smooth that transition or smooth that kind of permitting and planning process. So really, the fun thing about this project and this work is that it's really site and project specific. The challenge of this work is that it's really site and project specific. Cool. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll go through the last few slides that I have, and we can open it up to a broader conversation. I see I've answered everything that Montel is thinking about right now. Fantastic. So let me throw this back up. So we talked about some of the benefits earlier on, right? We talked about all of these. I just elaborate a little bit on the existing infrastructure opportunities. Closed landfills in particular are promising sites here for a couple reasons. One, landfills often have good sun exposure. There's not a lot of shading usually that's happening on large landfills. And there are other characteristics, sometimes mild sloping or kind of just general flat cap situations that support solar installation. Not every landfill is the same, but there are a lot of conditions here that could often support particularly a solar installation. You can't, in addition, there are limited reuse options. You simply can't do a lot. I don't think anyone here is going to raise their hand and say they're planning the next business park or five-star hotel or housing development on a closed landfill or even directly adjacent to it. And so that's partly for perception reasons, but also you can't really build foundations into a closed landfill. And those are there settling and holding our waste for decades. What you can do is build strategically on the surface where you are not disrupting the prior use and the current housing of our waste, and siting solar projects on there to generate energy and basically do something passively productive on the surface of the landfill. Environmental justice, I mentioned this before. Landfills offer sustainable non-hazardous reuses of sites. Often landfills were cited and maybe still are in some communities in areas where communities have less of a voice and often lower income. And so how can you do something that's healthy and safe as a productive reuse of the site? This is one option that makes that possible. And it's one option that, depending on how you structure the project, could also deliver some financial benefits to the community, bring some increased traffic, sales revenue, opportunities to support small and local businesses along the way by reactivating that site. And then potential for scale. I led this research, as I mentioned before, but there are thousands of active landfills in the US and many thousands that are already closed and inactive. And so, once folks get familiar with some of those design considerations that we talked about up front, the ballasted systems on cement blocks, working around existing infrastructure, that's pretty straightforward. You provide the site constraints and then you design a project that fits around that and works its way around that. So, I think closed landfills are particularly promising in brownfield site here, but there are a whole range of other situations. The first project I worked on in West Virginia was just a situation simply where the city had 1,500 acres of closed brownfield, or sorry, of brownfields from a steel mill facility. And they were a town of 20,000 people. They were not going to be getting investment for all 1,500 acres of that in the next couple decades. They have some promising momentum now for a few hundred acres, but we were able to take the most challenging, hardest to reach areas of that, about 200 acres of that, actually an island on an asbestos-lined bridge. EPA was not thrilled with that site tour, and actually repurposed some of that land while some of the other economic development activities were happening alongside. So, there are a whole range of situations where this can and cannot make sense. And really the goal is to think about how does this complement your goals and your needs to advance some of these projects. Look, it's I've shared the opportunity. You're all clearly excited. I want to be a little bit realistic here and note some of the challenges and complications. This is not vacant or undeveloped land, and so with that come additional complications for sure. Depending on the site and depending on the situation, there could be assessment and cleanup costs where time and resources are needed to evaluate and clean up some of those sites. That can increase project costs. There is funding available for that, with a few asterisks as to how it can be used, of course. But that will increase project time, project development, and project costs potentially if assessment and cleanup are needed. They're not always needed, but if they are, that can increase time and effort. Obviously, working around federal, state, or working with federal, state, and local regulations, considering permitting, zoning, land use, environmental reviews can add complexity to site requirements. And often, we've found that there's a little bit of hesitancy, especially in states that have not kind of set up clear guidelines or practices here yet. There are some states that are really leading the way, as I mentioned, and have clear guidance, clear points of contact, clear permitting processes to follow that make it really easy, or at least straightforward and clear on how to plan your projects. But there can be some uncertainty and complexity that comes from this. The site remediation timeline. If remediation is needed for this reuse, and it's less likely that it's needed for a clean energy reuse because you aren't planning to have, a housing project or an elementary school on that brownfield. But if remediation is necessary, that will add time and cost to the project. With brownfields questions, there's always a question of liability between stakeholders or site owners. And so clarifying that liability up front, if you are kind of stepping into this process, can be really helpful to just know where that stands. It's not a prohibitive factor, but it is really important to get clear on, who has that liability, or if there's any liability that potentially exists, to share with developers during procurement to de-risk that process. Again, clarity is the best friend here, so that folks who are working on this or planning or designing these projects know what they're working with. And then grid interconnection. This is not unrelated to Montel's question earlier. Interconnection costs and timelines, especially at that grid scale connection, can vary substantially between projects and locations due to existing infrastructure. A lot of the projects I'm working on right now, that Juby and I are working on right now, are connected at more of the distribution level. So we're not dealing with transmission level queue requests, but we are still dealing with distribution capacity and interconnection questions there. So it really depends on the size of your project, the location of it, and the other partners that are involved in determining kind of the interconnection opportunities. So I wanted to be honest with you. I don't want to just cheerlead this from the start, even though I love these types of projects and work directly on this. I think honesty and clarity is really important when we are setting forward here to go into any of these projects with your eyes wide open. So we started today talking about what are Brownfields and why. And I just want to wrap up briefly on how. And so when we think about some of those benefits and challenges, each of the following factors are going to shape here how a project may be planned and developed. So, you might have community goals that are shaping this capacity, local capacity, both staff and grid capacity here. The utilities game plan and the strategy there and how this integrates with the utilities portfolio and plans, site-specific factors, and other environmental regulations at the local, state, and federal level. Each of those will shape how this project moves forward. We've offered this, checklist here as you start to think about this. If you're at that starting point here, when you think about, hey, how do we balance some of the strategic reuse opportunities and some of these technical reuse questions? We encourage folks to ask, and we help folks think about this. Is this a productive reuse of the site? Does it reactivate a site that doesn't have current plans? Does it co-locate a site with a project that does have current plans to complement that reuse? Does this risk impeding future reuses? Look, we're not here to pit a solar project against a business park that you might have planned. We want to look for the sites that don't have that activation currently, or don't have future reuses in mind to make them productive community spaces. Is this the highest and best use of the site? How well does it align with the existing site owner goals or community visioning, zoning, right-of-way, land use considerations? Are those aligned? And as I mentioned before, can you co-locate this to further enhance an existing plan? That's also a possibility where it's complementary and not, in opposition to the goals. On the technical side, the first things that we look at are, does this site seem like it can reasonably support clean energy, particularly solar or maybe wind? If it can't, there's really no use in proceeding with that, and you can stop and start to think about other reuses. If it can, then you want to think about what technologies could make sense. Are there serious concerns about shading, wetlands, floodplains, or other environmental factors? Is there infrastructure on site or nearby that might complement that energy reuse? And then, as you think about the feasibility of the technology, you want to think about the feasibility for how that electricity gets consumed, whether it's connecting on site, as we showed with that Pittsburgh example, whether it's connecting into the distribution grid or at the transmission level. You want to look at, is there on-site or nearby demand for electricity? Would the electricity support the utilities grid and plans and management there too? So all of these factors are kind of just a preliminary checklist, but hopefully, we use this and hopefully you can too, to gut check, whether this is worth future time and effort that it takes to make one of these projects a reality. If some of these are red flags or a hard no, then it's probably not worth that fight. And so, if you are interested in this, if you are still super excited, even after some of those complications and questions, we are providing free technical assistance on these projects and with our partners, Kansas State University TAB. to communities and site owners, communities and nonprofit site owners who are trying to identify their most promising opportunities, understand the funding and financing equations here, and then accelerate procurement if you need to go through a competitive procurement effort and understand what that Brightfields market looks like in your region. So that is a broad level of technical assistance. If you have more specific questions that don't fit neatly in one of these categories, just ask. We can largely be flexible there, provided that we are a good fit for you and have the expertise that is helpful for that. If not, we'll readily redirect you in another place or be honest with you about it. So with that, I'm actually going to pause and just wrap up by taking any questions that folks have here. Appreciate the comments and participation thus far.
We did
So
have a question in the chat, Matthew.
Yes, thank you. And I see Montel, thank you. At what capacity level does economy of scale begin to flatten out? Oh, that's a great question, Montel. It really depends on, we certainly see kind of a nice economy of scale bump when you get from that kind of very small on-site level, kind of the couple hundred kilowatts, getting into that 1 megawatt to 5 megawatt range. And then, I can't answer that question fully here because I don't know the Oklahoma market fully on the T&D side of this as well. But the more that you're able to procure here, usually the better. The flattening out is probably going to happen closer to kind of that 50 to 100 megawatt level, where you start to see kind of less particular gains there. There's research out there on price from NREL and Lawrence Berkeley Labs on pricing on a megawatt scale. I don't know if it's Oklahoma specific, and so I just want to make sure that I don't give you national data that may not be relevant in your market. And if anyone else on the call, because I know we had some power developers here and utility folks, if anyone else wants to chime in from what you're seeing locally, this is also an opportunity to share that if you're comfortable. If you have other questions or other comments that you want to add, feel free to come off mute or just type them right into the chat. Otherwise, I assume I've answered everyone's questions and you have no concerns whatsoever.
There is the option for us to stop the recording and answer questions if some folks are not comfortable having questions answered on the recording. So just to put that out there.
That's a great point. Then let's go ahead and I'll show one more slide just for wrap-up purposes for the recording. And that simply is, we'll share out the slides from this as we discussed. We'll also have a recording. If that's helpful, please just reach out to us and ask. So we'll share that. And then again, happy to take questions for the rest of the conversation today or via email. And here are our key contact information. You can also get that from Tio and Sarah, who have been wonderful to host us today and invite you all. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in learning more about the technical assistance or just simply learning more about some of the facts and design considerations or processes that cities, counties, states, and other site owners are doing to advance Brightfields projects across the country. Let's stop the recording.